Yeah, a little bit of background. With my parents and grandparents, I've been visiting the Smokies since the 1940s. We, as was mentioned earlier, we're native Cincinnatians. I actually volunteer in the park, I maintain a trail. It's obviously a labor of love. I'll start off with the concept. Originally it was called the Emergency Conservation Work. It was always a temporary program. It went from 1933 through 1942, so every 2 years it had to be renewed. Here is FDR upon accepting the Democratic nomination, excuse me, in 1932. Promised, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. After election, FDR requested for the quick creation of a Civil Conservation Corps to be used for simple work, not interfering with normal employment, and confining itself to forestry, prevention of soil erosion, flood control, and similar projects. Congress approved the request for the CCC on March the 31st, 1933, and within 3 months. Can you imagine a government program within 3 months getting not only started, but having 250,000 men employed? A little bit of background on FDR, 32nd president, elected 4 times. Of course, passed away in office, born 1882, passed away in 1945. He had polio in 1921. They kind of really, unlike today where everyone has to know everything, it was kind of kept a secret. When he actually went to the dedication at Newfound Gap for the park, he basically drove himself. He had a specially equipped car so that he could do that. And his background was, he was actually the governor of New York from 1929 through 1932, and basically he started the kind of program that this Civil Conservation Corps became on a national basis. So he had some assistants, a gal that worked for him ended up being a major player in his administration by the name of Frances Perkins. This is, if you seek their monuments, look about you. This is out there in the Cades Cove area. That's where one of the camps was. Of course, got some wildlife there. And basically it built, as it says, roads, trails, bridges, buildings, campgrounds, and picnic areas in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Very important program for not only national parks but state parks. And here's the headquarters. Actually, the CCC put in the foundation. Contractors ended up putting the rest of the building together, but they put in 2 visitor centers. They put in all the park roads, the tunnels, the fire towers. There were over 12 fire towers in this park because, of course, lots of over 500,000 acres of land there. Put in over 800 miles of trails. I'm actually the first person living in Ohio to do all 800 miles of trails in the Smokies. So I know the trails pretty well, and that's one of the reasons why I volunteer, to sort of pay back for the wonderful experiences I had. They put in the campgrounds, picnic areas, and of course fish hatcheries. So they did everything to make this a usable situation. Here's a picture of the David C. Chapman camp in Greenbrier. You'll never see those 2 words separated normally, but in this case they were. David Chapman was actually the fellow that was responsible for the acquisition of the lands in the park. Not exactly the most popular fellow. Once people got this place, to put it mildly, there were signs out in Cades Cove, don't come within 50 miles of us, David, because we're not happy with you. But I think with some of the descendants that I've talked to that had, relatives that basically, sold their land, they realized that if it hadn't became a national park, all we'd have is condos and everything else. We wouldn't have this wonderful place that we now have. So that there were actually 22 CCC camps in the Smokies. Here's one of the, this is Ravensford, the nursery because actually 60% of the Smokies have been clear cut. 60% have been clear cut. So it was important to, basically revegetate. Can you imagine with the weather that we have sometimes, the amount of rain on this mountainous terrain, what would happen if they hadn't, reforested basically the area? Here's the process moving along a little better. Here's them at the fish hatchery. The next one's kind of an intriguing little shot too, how they transported them. This is how they got them out to the several thousand miles of streams within the park. They always put in native fish, but of course, the whole ecosystem got fouled up with, what was going on with the 18 lumber companies that basically, clear cut the area. We'll describe this avocation. It's actually a foreman, but they're referred to as limbs, locally employed men, showing the folks the technique to be used in the stone cutting. And of course, yes, they started with the big stuff, and then the CCC guys ended up having the job of getting it down into usable form. And of course, all the road abutments are set up with those rock formations. The tunnels out there on the New Fund Gap Road, there's 2 of them. And of course, this is the largest bridge ever built in the CCC, the Altamont Bridge. Beautiful setup out there. This is the Altamont Bridge over the Husky Branch area out there. Altamont's a really neat area to hike in, that little river area out there. And this is out there on Laurel Creek Road. If you're coming in from Townsend, you make the right turn and you almost immediately come upon this Laurel Creek Road tunnel. Of course, this next one shows the chestnut tree removal. One of the things that CCC did not do is use fire. That in those days was not considered to be good for a forest, which is just the opposite of what they realize today. So some of the concepts that they pursued have changed, but they were using, the thought processes of the time. And here's a couple of the guys there at Trillium Gap, which is real close to the trailhead that I maintain, which is called Old Sugarlands, which starts just away from the Sugarlands Visitor Center and goes up into Cherokee Orchard Road. Okay, why the need for the CCC? The Great Depression, 1929 stock market crash, that's a good starting point. Stocks had dropped to 20% of their October 1929 value. Unemployment was at 13.3 or 25% of the workforce. There was a timber famine, harvesting, tree diseases, insects, fire loss was greater than the new growth. So basically in those days, the lumber companies had the idea of clear cutting, and we were the land of plenty. They weren't really worried, so it's easy to criticize them, but we were sort of spoiled that we could kind of do what we wanted to do, and so it's easy to rip into the 18 lumber companies and say, hey, why did they do what they did? Well, that was sort of the game in those days. Recreational areas and roads were inadequate. So yeah, there were lots of needs. Here's a little picture of a man may be down, but he is never out. One of the sayings was, can you spare a dime? Can you imagine anyone asking, can you spare a dime now? Geez, what would that be for? Families, of course, were starving. The Dust Bowl, there were 20 black blizzards in 1935 that carried dust from the plains to Cleveland. There were 2.5 million Plains residences that left for other areas, and Plains area was defined as Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado. So major displacements, and of course, people without money. The worst of all possible things when you're forced to. Here's our little employment poster to say, hey guys, we're gonna give you something that's going to help not only you, but help this wonderful country of ours. The CCC camps, the number of camps From 33 through 42, the average was 1,643, and as I say, it was renewed every 2 years. So there was a political process that they had to go through. There was a lot of criticism of FDR for, how it was going to be administered, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But highest number at any time was 2,912. The lowest number was 399. The camp information, as far as the breakdown, the Agriculture Service had 71%, which included the Soil Conservation Group, which was basically for the farmers. Interior Department had 26.5, War Defense 2.5, and the average number of camps per state was 30. And of course, we only had 48 states, but there were, Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and District of Columbia and Virgin Islands also had activity. So it was a nationwide approach, obviously. The breakout of the number of staff, they were usually referred to as juniors or enrollees. The theoretical age limit was 18 to 25, but back in those days, birth records weren't exactly exciting. So depending on, the dynamics, sometimes some young people got in well below 18. And so the next group, African Americans, of course I didn't say there's almost 2,900,000 of the white Caucasian. It was all male, all male. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get down to the veterans. The African Americans, there were 250,000. There were about 150 camps, and most of the time they were not integrated camps. And we'll get into this concept that I'll next throw out there, is it had to be locally accepted. So in other words, there were places where the African Americans were not welcome, and the last thing in the world the bureaucrats wanted to do was create, a problem, because they had to have local acceptance because they were trying to help the local situation. So many of these ended up in national parks as far as the African Americans were concerned. But basically, before they put an African American camp into an area, they basically checked with a local power structure to make sure that they would be accepted. Otherwise, they knew they were creating a problem that was not going to work out very well. War veterans, this is actually due to Eleanor. The First World War veterans had been promised a bonus for their service, and it had been put off. It was originally going to be paid in 1945. Well, when this whole Depression thing came about and unraveled everybody's universe, the veterans said, hey, this is not fair. They ended up having a massive march on Washington. FDR, in his infinite wisdom, said, Eleanor, would you go meet with the World War I vets and have a discussion with them and see if we can work out something? And basically she came back and said, include them in the CCC. And that was a win-win kind of deal. And he then worked with Congress, and the bonus ended up actually being paid in 1936. But it was a real wonderful thing that Eleanor pulled off. Next group, the Native Americans, they didn't have the age descriptions. By the way, the juniors couldn't be married. The Native Americans could be married, and they did all their work on their own tribe. And so it worked through their tribal structure, basically. Then the territorial, as I said, it was 50,000 that ended up there. The locally employed men, this was a really important thing. The reason it was important is, once again, to get acceptance locally, because we got a lot of unemployed guys, and then you're bringing in these camps with all outsiders, and obviously that could create some major, problems. So the expertise to supervise was going to be sent to these locally employed men. They could be married, they were paid more, $45 a month if they were the lead guy. So that was, once again, an attempt to get better acceptance of what was going on here. The criteria for eligibility, As you can see, citizen, male, physically fit, between ages of 18 and 25, unmarried, unemployed, willing to work for $30 a month with $25 going home. And you say, wait a minute, they're only working for $5? Well, of course, all their expenses were paid. And of course, where they came from, all they were was a drain on the family. So this was, and plus they ended up in better circumstance. They got clothes every 3 months if they were worn out legitimately, and of course their meals were taken care of, their room and board obviously, so it basically, freed up, the part of the burden on the individual families. Many of the older men in the family were having to actually leave, to go somewhere else to try to find a job. So getting one off of the family, or sometimes maybe more than one, was a great help. And then a volunteer, but willing to remain in camp and work for a minimum of 6 months is what the deal was. Less than 10% of the enrollees were actually high school graduates. So once again, education wasn't at the level that it is in this day and age. Here's one of the applications. The various agencies, there were actually over 25 U.S. government agencies involved. 25 government agencies, and you pull this thing off in 3 months. That's pretty impressive. Maybe they should find out how they did that and pass that along on some of our programs that they try. And there were actually 9 core areas. And the War Department, though, was the one that actually provided the management before the workday started. So, and that's an important factor that we'll kind of get into. But before we get that far, I'll go into a little story because I like bringing alive the experience. In 1937, 19-year-old Dolphus Park from Avery County, North Carolina, left his home to drive his father to pay taxes. Unbeknownst to him, he was on his way to enroll in the Civil Conservation Corps. Dolphus' father had decided that in order to keep his son out of trouble, he would sign him up for duty in the CCC. One of the other things is your family had to be on the relief rolls. And so how they determined where the number of people were coming from was tied into the relief rolls around the country. And of course, their goal was to keep the enrollees as close to home as possible. The only problem with that is many of the projects were west of the Mississippi and most of the people were east of the Mississippi. So that created some interesting dynamics. But Dolphus ended up, had a job driving a truck. And his father, of course, was worried he was hanging around with the wrong boys and would end up in trouble. And he ended up being a truck driver for the rest of his day. So many job skills were acquired by these fellows as they went through this. And here's a picture that we just added of the physical. You had to pass the physical. And as you can see, all different sizes, and here they are doing a little bit of their conditioning, which of course is kind of important. The physicals were of course mandatory, and then the conditioning basically before they were allowed to be sent off to camp. And here's their expression, which is "we can take it." That does not mean they were going to steal. That means we can handle it, in today's vernacular when all's said and done. It's an interesting saga. Here's the organizational chart. As I say, this was basically Army structure, commanding officer, junior officers, education leaders, doctor, part-time chaplain. Usually they had at least one religious service a week. And so, as I say, before the job started and after the job was done, this is the structure they were under. Gosh, doesn't that sort of fit when World War II starts? We already have people, 3 million people that have already, got acclimated to this concept of, hey, this is the way, we live. So frankly, one of my opinions is I'm not sure we would have won the Second World War without the CCC either. because these guys were ready to roll and they were disciplined and had learned a lot and learned how to work together, which isn't the simplest thing at times. Here's the typical workday: 600 reveille, shave, shower, and prepare for the day. 6:30 calisthenics, 7 o'clock breakfast, 7:30 policing of the barracks and grounds, 7:45 work sick call, 12 lunch, 1600 return to camp 3 times, 1700 retreat in dress uniform, 1730 dinner in dress uniform, 1800 free time, recreation or class. We'll talk more about the classes. 2145, in other words 9:45, the lights are flashed to warn of lights out. The 2200 lights out, 2250 taps, and 2300 bed check. So a very, this is, and we'll talk where these things came from, but this is one of the poems that one of the guys wrote, the Psalm of CCC. The CCC is my restoration, I shall not want. But it maketh me arise early in the morning, it giveth me baths with hard water. It restoreth my appetite, it leadeth me in the paths of work for my bankroll's sake. Yea, though oft do KP duty from morning to night, I will fear no evil, for the infirmary is near me, the oils and pills, they discomfort me. Tables are prepared for me in the presence of my buddies. My plate is heaped up, my stomach all but runneth over. Surely gold bricking and tree nursing shall not follow me all the days of my life, but I shall probably remain in the CCC forever. Yes. And here's the guys heading off. Yes. And as you can see, all different ages, sizes, and that was, might as well jump into that a little bit. So, you've got basically the city boys and the country boys. The difference between the two, besides physically where they live, was their background. The city boys tended to be better educated. Country boys were good with how to do things. And so that dynamic was sort of, interesting, to put it mildly. And then, of course, we have boys from the north, and then we have boys from the south, which, once again, for those that are into the Civil War history, many of the Civil War people hadn't sort of forgotten about that, so that could be a potential problem when you put 200 men in a camp. So there were a lot of dynamics, and as I say, the city boys tended to be better educated. Many of the country boys, as I say, were very accustomed to hard work. But the city boys, a lot of them were softies, even though they might not have been the best people in the world, they, might have been doing some stuff that wasn't kosher. But so all that dynamic of putting 200 guys together sort of gives you a potpourri of all sorts of things. And here they are arriving at the first camp, which is in George Washington National Forest. It's just west of Shenandoah, and it's 100 miles from Washington, D.C. And I'll give you a couple of thoughts here on some of the initiation trips that they did. Following Army tradition, new enrollees were called rookies. Each camp had its own routine, but it became CCC tradition for rookies to undergo initiation. They were sent to the woods with a sack and a lantern on a snipe hunt, or to the supply room for striped paint, left-handed monkey wrenches, or elbow grease. The beds were sometimes short-sheeted, or they were told to water the flagpole. So lots of little tricks just to kind of see, if we can. One of the other crazy ones was, go see if you can push that flagpole down. It's a little too high. Please bring it down. And so there were all sorts of little initiation things. Here's the poster there at the first camp. And here's a picture of the locally employed men at the start of the workday, basically clearing them in what the job was going to be. So they were either trucked, or if it was close by, they were, they walked to it. In the Smokies, they set up a lot of what they call spike camps because of the logistics, and those were temporary camps that would exist for a couple of months, and basically that would just save for the logistics of getting the guys to the campsite. Here's Henry Rich. He's the little fellow here on the right. And he was fairly typical. He was actually the first enrollee. He ended up actually spending 7 years. And normally if you were just an enrollee, 2 was the max. But then if you got promoted into this LEM environment, then you could, stay. And he actually stayed for 7 years and of course was a camp cook. The average enrollee was 5'8", 147 pounds, and basically about 18 to 19. And the average had about 8 years of schooling, so not even high school. But in the first 3 months, in spite of doing the hardest work they've probably ever done, since they're much better fed, they gained 12 to 15 pounds on average. So, wow. In other words, yeah, that food was really important, and it changed everything. And last but not least, it gave them skills, which is, here's some of the tent quarters. When they of course started off, they ended up with temporary tents just to get things rolling. I saw some statistics on desertion rates, which is defined as being away from the position for more than 8 days. In 1933, it was 8%, and then 4 years later, it had gone up to 19 to 20%, and the reason being jobs were a little more available, which, by the way, if you got a job and they encouraged you to be developing skills and they actually helped you with interviewing, and as soon as you got a job, then you could leave. But sometimes, for other reasons, they decided to sort of desert. Here's a shot of Shenandoah National Park, but we have one little cold weather story. My most vivid and wild memory was working on the wood detail, sawing and splitting wood to supply the camp with firewood for heating in all the buildings during Christmas week. Most of the camp was home on a 5-day Christmas leave. It was 64 degrees below zero. This camp, of course, was up in Minnesota. We worked in 15-minute shifts. We wore mufflers covering our noses and mouths so we wouldn't frost our lungs. And they ended up wearing 3 pairs of socks. So that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. Glad I wasn't involved in that one. Here's several of the, this is the captain and lieutenant over at Shenandoah National Park at a place called Big Meadows, which is one of their major spots. Here's the camp in, actually, at Sugarlands. There are actually 2 camps there at Sugarlands, and this old rock formation here was where they had their company number, and they also had a clock there. That's actually on the trail that I maintained, the old Sugarlands Trail. Here's a couple of park superintendents. The one second from the left, he's the one of Grand Canyon. The second from the right is the one from Rossecan, from the Great Smokies. So they were constantly, dealing with politicians, because once again, every 2 years you had to resell this program. So there was a lot of interaction going on. Here's actually a shot of the, this is the Sugarlands camp setup. The interesting thing about it, though, back to the money part of this, it costs $22,000 for camp construction. So that money's going into that local economy. So that helps sell the fact that, hey, we're going to do something good, but oh, by the way, and then it costs $3,500 to $5,000 monthly for food and supplies. So it was a major financial impact to each location for, each individual camp. Here's some of the LEMs sort of staying around. They were paid by the using service, but they were actually sworn into the CCC. They could be married. And of course, they had the trade and supervisory skills. And as I mentioned, the camp leaders got $45 a month, the assistant got $36, and they kept the money. And they actually, if they were close, they could actually still live at home if the logistics worked out. And once again, this was so important to get acceptance locally, because these are local guys. These aren't being brought in from California to the Smokies. These are Tennessee guys that are getting these jobs. And by the way, many of the camps were set up on old farmlands, right next to where the house was, or to where the lumber companies had their headquarters. So they made use of, facilities that were already there and had already been sort of at least set up for, potential use. So there was a lot of smart stuff that was taking place. And here's a shot that we just added too. Does he look like he's 17? I don't think so, but he was the bugler. So they had recordings, there were bugles to kind of get things started in the morning. And here's our after dinner saluting of the flag. They were provided 2 sets of clothing. Work clothes were blue denim. The dress code was Army olive drab. Gee, isn't that odd that it's Army olive drab? Yeah, so, but deliberately they downplayed the Army part of it because they didn't want to make it into, hey, this is a war thing that we got going. But as I say, it really kind of, to put it mildly, worked out well when we ended up with the mess that we ended up with Pearl Harbor. This is the lineup for the roll call, work call. Senior leaders gave the assignments, and as I mentioned before, they either walk or rode to the job. Here's the typically there were 5 40-bed dorms. We do have a little bed check story here. In the CCC, in my camps at least, you slept in open barracks. Everyone had to be in his bed by lights out. In our camp, there was a mandatory bed check each night. What that entailed was the night guard coming to the door of the barracks and looking in the door to see that everyone was in bed under the blankets when we were supposed to be. Now, this particular night guard, who was not one of our officers, was a real son of a gun. He would come when we were asleep and shine the flashlights in your face and be noisy, generally making a pain of himself. Well, one night we decided to get him for fun. Each of us had a shoe, one of our boots handy, and none of us went to sleep. We waited for the night guard, then when he came into the door and shined his stinking flashlight at us, wham, 30 boots came flying at him. He was buried in them. Everyone was laughing for a second. The light was suddenly switched on as a bellow of cursing came from the man in the door who, we realize now, wasn't the night guard we expected. It was one of the Army lieutenants. What a grand and glorious feeling that was. Oh yes. Best laid plans of men and mice. This is actually them stuffing their mattresses with straw. I mean, talk about creative. I mean, this. Yeah, they had their act together. They knew what was going on. So if the going ever gets tough, think of this. And of course, this is the chow. Critical. There was actually one camp that I read where the Army commander was let go because there was inspections by the U.S. Army quarterly at each camp. And there had been a major revolution at this particular camp, and 100 CCC guys got thrown out. And what they were complaining about was the bad food, so the Army decided, okay, we're going to go check, see what happened. Well, lo and behold, the Army commander was not exactly using all of the money to get good food. He was getting about the worst possible but cheap stuff. And so he basically got fired on the spot once they realized what this character, but right, as you can imagine, I mean, the major plus of this, besides all the skills and the interactions and helping the environment, everything else is, the health of these guys. And so, this was important. So the cook staff was probably the most important staff in the entire organization, because that's how you kept morale up. And here's, the inside of the setup here. And of course, they had their own little post exchange, which was open from 7:30 to 9 at night. Soda, candy, cigarettes, of course, were worried about in those days. And there was beer, of course, that was served at the veterans camps, because of course they're in a whole different set of dynamics age-wise. Here's the other wonderful thing that came out of this program. The educational part, as time went on, they realized, to make sure that these guys had skills, first of all, they got to be able to read and write. And second of all, the job skills. So if they got any of these classes, if there were 10 people interested, they held a class. And they got a certificate after they completed it. But and most of the guys kind of caught on, well, yeah, I might as well while I'm doing, how many games of pool do I want to shoot, let's go, get some skills here. And of course, then they had the job-related skills that, were taught, from the standpoint of this is the way to do it, not just out there on the job and, hey, you better get this thing done, kind of deal. So all sorts of, because I think in my book, I listed over 30 different trades that these guys ended up mastering based on, what this wonderful program did. But, so the program got more sophisticated as time went on. A lot of it was due to this Frances Perkins lady that was in charge of the program. She really used her head and said, we're going to make a difference, in these people's lives. And here we have a little classroom going on. Just, you name it, and they had a class for it. And the guys, as I say, as time went on, really caught on. Church services, as I say, at least once a week. Usually they were visiting ministers, and several different ministries were brought in, depending, what area and where the guys had came from. And here's some reproducing of colonial furniture at Yorktown National Park, because those were any preservation type thing the CCC could get involved in. This is always an interesting one. The safety honor roll on the left side is those people that have done their job and there have been no problems. On the right side, if you make that list, you're embarrassed. That's the careless side, and you want to avoid that because your buddies are going to sort of needle you, and on the right side then they list what you did wrong. So, and actually the safety record, for instance, one of the major activities that they did to help society was firefighting. When they kept statistics on the CCC firefighters versus the regular firefighters, the CCC were, they only had 1/3 the problems that the national statistics were for fighting fire. So they really, were taught well, because once again, they were taught by people that, knew what they were doing, and these guys were trying to learn to pick up some skills. And of course, there's a little bit of fun to be had here. Got to work on our pool game. And of course, they had the football. But this is one of my favorites. Guys teaching each other how to dance. This is dangerous. This is dangerous. No, that shouldn't be done. But once again, one of the things that they would do is they'd have open houses, which we'll show in the next shot here, and that was multifaceted. Sometimes a busload of the young ladies locally were brought in addition to the locals that they were trying to clue in that, hey, these aren't a bunch of jerks, and these aren't a bunch of troublemakers, these are a bunch of good people. And so, back to that, getting locally accepted was really important. So of course they told the guys, you better be on your best behavior, well, we got people coming in here, or you're in big time trouble. So it was really, and of course there were many marriages that came out of this when all is said and done. But if you look at it the other way, how about the local guys that are not part of the CCC? They weren't quite as thrilled with this. And for instance, in Shenandoah National Park, there's a documented case where they would set fires on Friday night in that area to make sure that the CCC guys couldn't go to town on a weekend because they were going to be busy fighting the fire. So this local acceptance, it depends who's involved kind of deal. So yeah, the more you read about some of this stuff, it's like, holy cow, right, it's, just what happens with human beings, And Of course, these guys that would do some of those tricks are probably unemployed and very bitter that they didn't get into the program, or that they just thought these guys were taking all the local girls. What's going on here? Come on. This is the national newspaper called Happy Days, which basically was kind of a PR thing, and it accentuated the positive. It talked about safety, patriotism. It had various columns on brass hats, and there's a champions column there. But one of the most interesting things they did is they had encouraged each of the camps to have their own camp paper. And what they started doing is they started evaluating the camp papers, and they put them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the top and 5 being the worst. And they also offered $5 for any poem that was printed, back to some of these poems that I end up showing, and a $1 for inventions or suggestions that improved anything in the CCC. So it was kind of an interesting little tool, but it kind of, and once again, it fit into the selling of the CCC. There were actually 33 presentations put together to promote the Civil Conservation Corps that were spread in various media environments to, once again, keep selling it. So a lot of dynamics that went into this. Here's the one over there in Cherokee, North Carolina. 80% of the camps had their own paper. Arizona had one called the Depression Cure. There was one in the Phantom Ranch called the Ace in the Hole. Kansas had one called the AWOL, which is All's Well on the Limestone. Washington had one called One or Up and Atom. California, this is a crazy one, had one called the Tabloid Owl. And its motto was, it's a paper for people who think they think. Okay. Everybody, raise up. All right, that's us. Right. Work projects. Yes. This actually is over in Shenandoah, the Skyline Drive. You know, that's got 105 miles. And actually, that was the concept that the park superintendent here in the Smokies was talking about doing here, was actually doing the road right across the crest, just like they did in Shenandoah. That's a 105-mile road over there, and it's got 75 overlooks. Ross Eakin was voted down. He was not allowed to do that. And of course, Shenandoah is actually topographically lower than the Smokies. Could you imagine the wintertime all across the crest, how often that would be open? Probably not very much with the approach that's used. But of course, they opened up these isolated areas. Of course, the Smokies and Shenandoah are hooked up by the Blue Ridge Parkway, and it goes for 469 miles, starting from Cherokee and goes all the way up to the south end of Shenandoah. Here's one of the major things that they created, the fire towers. Really important, of course. And as I say, they were not a believer in fires, but they had the guys that were stationed out there, but they had to build them. The one on the left is actually Mount Cameron, which is probably my favorite spot in the park. It's got the best view because it's where it sits. You always get wind, so you get the best view. Once you get up there, it's not an easy hike, but if you ever get a chance, check it out. As you can tell, it's got a walkway around it. Really cool spot up there. And the other one is the Klingman's Dome, which now they've got the cement deal that kind of circles around. But there was a fire tower, and once again, they had 2 fire towers could see the same spot. Is the way they figured out how they put in the fire towers so that they could make sure they had a real fire or what was going on kind of deal. The trail work on the retaining walls, without retaining walls on some of this terrain, I mean, these things are just going to disintegrate, with the amount of moisture, unlike what's happened this year that normally happens. And of course, here's the Chestnut Light. This actually is over there in Shenandoah, and that's the problem with the diseases. Once those kind of things happen, now what are you going to do? And this was right in their open area called Big Meadows over there in Shenandoah. This is FDR dedicating over there at Shenandoah. The fellow that was in charge of the program was a guy by the name of Robert Fechner, and FDR, one of his problems was the unions weren't real happy with this concept, saying, wait a minute, is this going to take away union jobs? And so he put the guy in charge of the International Association of Machinists in charge of the program to sell the fact that, no, this isn't going to hurt the unions. And there was some criticism that they were going to allow Democrat CCC enrollees. No, they didn't do that at all, because he knew they ain't going to play. They're not going to accept this program. Yeah, this is some of the tree transplanting, which, as you can tell, man, major activities. Another one. Yeah, you would be on the right side of that. King George the Sixth and Queen Elizabeth visited one of the camps in 1939. This is a little round top at Gettysburg, because there had been some major weather problems, and they basically had to redo that whole area. That was, one of the most important sites during the Civil War. This is over there at Gettysburg. This particular group, they ended up resetting thousands of grave headstones, and this is an African American group, so it was accepted in that area. This particular firefighting group was an African American group too, and basically they, one of the ways that they had of communication, they fought the 1935 Malibu fire, and they were the first company using homing pigeons from the front lines back to the base camp to get the word of how things are going or not going out here. And here's, as I say, some of the work, and as I say, their safety record was really impressive. Here's some of the Native Americans. The Native Americans probably, when this problem or when this program stopped, were probably the ones that got hit the most, because they didn't have any fallback programs. Here they're doing what they call rip-wrapping to set up a canal so that the water is going to flow where they want it to go. Short and long-term benefits. All states and nearby communities receive benefits financially and quality of life. 40,000 CCC illiterates were taught to read. Each enrollee improved financially, physically, mentally, and in marketable job skills. Families of enrollees receive a significant income, a total of $663 million in the Depression, big time. Established conservation awareness and advocates and a model for conservation programs. Yeah, so these guys, right, they experience parks. Yeah, they experience parks. Significant public visitation. There were only 13 states that had a decent number of state parks before the CCC came. There are 830 after CCC. 90% of the CCC enrollees served the country in World War II. And of course, very simply, we'll go through these kind of quick. Collected 13 million tree seeds, 6 million man days operating. Oh, here's the big one. 3 billion trees planted. 3 billion trees. 4 million man days in firefighting, 68,000 miles of fire break. 40 million acres of farmlands received erosion control, 972 million fish stocked in 7,600 diversion dams, 1.2 million man days of emergency work on the floods in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. Great Smokies Park, Shenandoah, 360 Civil War battlefields, 4,000 historic structures, 38,500 bridges, 89,000 miles of telephone lines. And here's the Cumberland Mountain State Park, which is of course in Tennessee, which is actually the largest bridge. I misspoke a little bit. The second largest is the Elkmont. This was done by Sergeant Alvin York, who's the Medal of Honor recipient. Great story. It's covered in more detail in the book. This is FDR dedicating the park at the Smokies in 1940. This is Glacier National Park. They're having lunch, as you can probably tell. This is the bottom of the Grand Canyon where that ace in the hole paper was. This is the swimming pool that no longer exists at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Now it's kind of a camping area. And this is, they're putting in the trail that connects two of the trails. It's a 2 million, yeah, they had to blast 1,000 feet above the floor, 2-mile trail. And they put in the phone lines out there. And that's the retaining wall of the south rim. This is one of the CCC guys being taken out that had appendicitis at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. This is some work out there in Sequoia, cutting down a dead tree. This is in Zion, one of our really exciting parks. You usually don't see that much snow in Zion. This is the road, one of the roads that heads into Zion they worked on. This is the cables in Yosemite up to Half Dome. Yeah. Whoa. And this is some work going on in Mammoth Cave. This is Shenandoah. That's a rock water fountain. And this is the one that out in Mount Rainier National Park, and we just added this picture, but more importantly, we added this picture, and this might be a good way to wrap things up. This is an ice cave that the guys were able to visit. This is an ice cave in Mount Rainier National Park that the guys were able to visit that existed up until 1970. Of course, global warming has now changed a lot of stuff, and the ice cave there no longer exists, but this was one of their off-duty things that they would do. Wow, wouldn't that be a cool thing to jump off into? And a little bit of boxing here. Baseball, of course. And of course, gotta have the music and the bonding that happened with these guys was incredible. The friendships, 50 years after the fact, there's about 80 different interviews in the book that basically, when reunions were held, they ended up transcribing them, and I went through and picked out some, really interesting stories, and it just kind of blows your mind. But on that note, let's end up with the final little poem that one of the guys wrote. We built 1 million bridges and walked through miles of mud. We've cleaned 1 million mess kits and peeled 1 million spuds. We've shoveled tons of gravel, 1 million rocks we've lugged, but there'll be no rocks in heaven, for we've lugged our rocks in hell. We've killed 1 million ants and bugs that sneaked in for our eats. We've shook 1 million bed bugs from our dirty sheets, and the number of nights we've frozen is low the mercury fell, but we'll not freeze in heaven, because we've done our hitch in hell. We've heard 1 million whistles blow from morning to late at night. How we like to kill the dirty bums that robbed us of our rights. And the foremen that we've had over us, how many we can't tell, but we'll bar them all from heaven till they do their hitch in hell. When that final call is sounded and we've laid aside life's cares, we'll do our final big parade right up those golden stairs. The angels, they will welcome us, their harps will start to play. Then we'll draw 1 million canteen checks and spend them in a day. It is then we will hear St. Peter greet us loudly with his yell. Take those front seats, CCC boys, for you've done your hitch in hell. That's our presentation for today.
The book is available again.
Oh yes, yeah, the book is available, and it's a labor of love. But I think, as I say, what makes it unique is not only does it explain the program and make the case for why it's America's second best idea, but it shares these individual stories that I find very intriguing. It took 4.5 years, but it was well worth